Today we are going to discuss internal control systems. Indiana Code 5-11-1-27 requires each political subdivision to maintain a system of internal control to promote government accountability and transparency. The information on the following slides supplement and support the PowerPoint presentation on the Uniform Internal Control Standards for Indiana Political Subdivisions Manual issued by the State Board of Accounts. The presentation materials are located in Part 2 of the manual, which is available on the State Board of Accounts website, www.in.gov/SBOA. When you go to our website, you will find political subdivisions listed on the left under SBOA Home. Click on Internal Controls. There's information about the internal control standards. If you scroll down to the training section, that is where you'll find the internal control manual. Why do we talk about internal controls and then find it difficult to take action? Well, controls are not uniform. Although many governmental units are similar in organizational structure, they are different in many ways. Because the type and number of governing bodies, departments, community needs, and staffing vary between entities, the same internal control system cannot be utilized for every unit of government. Controls are not tangible. They are not something you can really see or touch. However, they should have tangible evidence that a control is occurring. They are not rocket science, but in order to be effective, they have to be more than just thoughts in the mind of management. They have to be something that can be implemented. This presentation will help you to obtain an understanding of what internal controls are and how to implement them. To gain an understanding of internal controls, we will discuss the 3 categories of objectives, the 5 components of internal control systems, COSO, the Green Book, which were used to develop our internal control standards and include expanded guidance on the role of those in charge of governance in internal control systems, adjusted for increased dependency on IT, and the 17 principles under the 5 components. First, let's look at what you need for an effective internal control system. An effective system of internal control requires that each of the 5 components and 17 principles are present and functioning, and the 5 components operate together in an integrated manner. A major control deficiency exists if the governmental unit cannot conclude that these are met. This image shows how the 5 components of internal control are integrated into the governmental unit's operational structure to ensure that management's objectives are achieved. Internal controls should be designed and implemented for each of management's objectives. The controls should consider the governmental unit's operational structure and address each of the 5 internal control components. Management's objectives must first be defined so that controls can be designed to meet those objectives. Management's objectives have been divided into 3 broad categories: operations, reporting, and compliance. At times, these objectives may overlap. Operations objectives include operational and performance goals along with the effectiveness and efficiencies of operation, including the safeguarding of assets. Some examples of operation objectives would be the regular day-to-day duties like ensuring monies collected are deposited and recorded in the records, that disbursements made are recorded in the records, payroll is processed timely and accurate, as well as many other operational functions. Reporting objectives include both financial and non-financial information, internal and external to the unit, with an expectation of reliability, accountability, and transparency. This would include ensuring that required reports are filed on time and accurate, and that they reflect the true activity of the unit. Compliance objective ensures the adherence to laws and regulations. local, state, and federal laws and regulations that are applicable to the unit. As mentioned earlier, some objectives may overlap. A good example of overlapping objectives would be the annual budget. Units are required to establish an annual budget and have it approved by DLGF, which is a compliance objective. The unit is required to stay within that budget, so in order to achieve that, appropriations are set up within the financial accounting system and monitored throughout the year as part of the daily operations, which is an operations objective. DLGF also requires that certain information be reported by specific deadlines in order to have the budget approved, so there is a reporting objective as well. To ensure all the objectives are met, the unit may need to establish multiple controls or may be able to establish a control that meets multiple objectives. When designing a control system, all 5 internal control components should be addressed: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, monitoring activities. If any of the 5 components is missing, true internal control is not achieved. Control environment acts as the foundation for a sound system of internal control. It sets the standards, processes, and structures, management's tone, integrity and ethical values of the political subdivision, and includes performance, measurements, incentives, and rewards. Risk assessment requires management to consider the impact of possible changes in the external environment and within the political subdivision that may render internal control ineffective. Many organizations take a risk-based approach to internal control, which includes risk identification, risk analysis, and risk response. Control activities are the actions established through policies and procedures to mitigate risks to the achievement of objectives. They are preventative and detective in nature, manual and automated activities, and includes segregation of duties. Internal controls should be designed to combat fraud and misstatements. This includes prevention and detection activities. Prevention activities are designed to deter the occurrence of an unfavorable event. Detection activities are designed to identify unfavorable events that have already occurred in a timely manner. Unfavorable events include fraud and misstatements due to errors and omissions. Misstatements may or may not be intentional. Intent is the major factor in determining fraud. If you look at the fraud triangle, you will see it includes 3 items: pressure, rationalization, and opportunity. Financial need is the most common pressure. The need may be due to several factors or combination of factors, such as a gambling problem, excessive medical bills, excessive lifestyle, loss of household income, family-related issues, divorce, or any other issue that may cause a financial strain in a person's household. Rationalization are the excuses for their behavior. Some examples of rationalization are, "I'll pay it back," "I put in a lot of hours, this job owes me," "I don't get paid enough," "It's only a small amount, the unit has plenty of money." Opportunity occurs when there are weaknesses in the unit's internal control system. The person may recognize that no one else sees the records or reports, that no one asks any questions, that officials may have an "I don't care" attitude. The amounts usually start out small to test the controls, and if it isn't caught, usually grows into large amounts and continues until it becomes obvious. When these 3 elements are present, it can be hard for even the most honest person not to take advantage of the situation. If opportunity can be reduced or eliminated with a good internal control system, this will reduce the risk of fraud. Relevant information includes both internal and external sources. Communication is the continual process of providing, sharing, and obtaining necessary information. This provides transparency and sets the tone for management and officials' attitude toward their responsibilities. The information to be provided, as well as who the information will be communicated to, should be clearly defined. The following things should be considered when making those decisions. There should be an emphasis of the importance of quality information, the volume and sources, complexity of processes, technology advances, and greater interaction with third-party vendors. Monitoring activities should be designed to evaluate whether internal controls are present and functioning. In some cases, control and monitoring activities may be the same. For example, a review of reconciliation with the intent to detect errors would be a control activity, while a review of the same reconciliation with the intent to determine if the control was actually occurring and functioning properly would be a monitoring activity. Monitoring activities should be ongoing and have separate evaluations. Ongoing activities would be built into the business process at various levels so that it will provide timely information. Or separate evaluations would be conducted periodically, and the frequency would depend on the assessment of risks and effectiveness of ongoing evaluations. New principles were established by the Committee of Sponsoring Organization, or COSO, to clarify requirements of effective internal control using 17 principles. These requirements are included in the Standards for Internal Control in the Federal Government, otherwise known as the Green Book. Accordingly, the standards adopted by the State Board of Accounts were based on this conceptual framework. These 17 principles help to clarify and define the 5 components of internal control. Each principle relates to a component of the internal control system and are based on common sense. We will discuss these principles and provide some general examples of control procedures. Please keep in mind that the examples are just samples of control procedures to help understand what controls in each of the internal control components might look like. Remember that controls should be specific to your entity. There are more examples and case studies in Part 2 of the Internal Control Manual. Control environment contains the first 5 principles. Number 1, the oversight body and management demonstrate a commitment to integrity and ethical values. Number 2, the oversight body oversees the entity's internal control system. Number 3, management establishes an organizational structure, assigns responsibility, and delegates authority to achieve the political subdivision's objectives. Number 4, management demonstrates a commitment to attract, develop, and retain competent individuals. And number 5, management evaluates performance and holds individuals accountable for their internal control responsibilities. One term that we need to define is oversight body. The oversight body works with management to develop and implement internal controls. While management would design and implement internal controls, the oversight body has the ultimate responsibility to oversee that the internal controls have been implemented and are being followed by the political subdivision as a whole. By default, the oversight body would be the legislative body for each political subdivision, such as the county commissioners, city council, school board, or township board. However, the legislative body could establish a separate oversight body or committee. In doing so, the legislative body would need to designate which positions would serve on the oversight body and what the responsibilities of the oversight body would be. The oversight body and management need to make sure their expectations, policies, and procedures are clearly defined and communicated throughout the unit. Their attitude towards integrity and ethical values should be evident. Some examples of procedures that may accomplish this are as follows: conveying periodic messages throughout the unit, continually evaluating internal control to ensure procedures are being implemented and are effective, providing a method of confidential reporting, establishing policies and procedures to address violations, clearly defining job responsibilities, employee evaluations, as well as criteria for hiring and retaining qualified personnel. risk assessment contains the next 4 principles. Number 6, management defines objectives clearly to enable the identification of risks and defines risk tolerances. Number 7, management identifies, analyzes, and responds to risks related to achieving the defined objectives. Number 8, management considers the potential for fraud when identifying, analyzing, and responding to risks. And number 9, management identifies, analyzes, and responds to significant changes that could impact the internal control system. Basically, this means that management should be identifying areas where things could go wrong and develop procedures that would address those risks. This should be done for each of management's objectives. When evaluating risks, management should consider the effects of changes in the entity and inherent risk for those activities. Anytime there is a change in the entity's environment, a risk assessment should be performed to determine how that change may impact the control structure of the unit. Some changes that may increase or decrease risks are changes in management or responsibilities, rapid growth, new technology or software, new programs or services, changes in laws and regulations, economic stability, and other changes in operations or unit structure. Inherent risk considers the nature of the transaction or activity. Things to consider when assessing inherent risk are the complexity of the activity itself or the calculations performed, the susceptibility of the activity to fraud or misappropriation, extent of judgment involved, size and volume of items comprising that activity, and likelihood and impact. After identifying the impact of any changes and assessing an inherent risk, management needs to develop a response. The response may include not making any changes, modifying current control procedures, eliminating ineffective control procedures, and/or developing new control procedures. Whatever the outcome, it should be communicated to the appropriate personnel to ensure proper implementation. Internal control procedures require evaluation and adjustment on a regular basis to ensure risks are being appropriately addressed. Control activities contain 3 principles. Number 10, management designs control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks. Number 11, management designs the political subdivision's information system and related internal control activities to achieve objectives and respond to risks. Number 12, management implements control activities through policies. Control procedures should be designed to prevent, detect, or reduce the identified risks that interfere with achieving management's objectives. This internal control component typically contains your most important or key controls. An integral part of the control activity component is segregation of duties. Segregation of duties helps to eliminate or reduce the opportunity for a single individual to either intentionally or accidentally misstate financial information. As mentioned before, eliminating or reducing opportunity can reduce the risk of fraud and misappropriation of assets. It may be difficult for very small units to achieve proper segregation of duties. For these units, compensating activities should be implemented, which may include additional levels of review for key operational processes, random and/or periodic review of selected transactions. The reviews and testing may be performed by the governing boards or other elected officials. Some examples of control activities are reconciliations, authorizations, approval processes, performance reviews, and verification processes. More specific examples related to payroll, disbursements, receipts, and credit cards can be found in Part 2 on pages 7 through 14 of the Uniform Internal Control Standards for Indiana Political Subdivisions issued by the SBOA. Information and communication contain the next 3 principles. Number 13, management uses quality information to achieve the political subdivision's objectives. Management internally communicates the necessary quality information to achieve the political subdivision's objectives. Number 15, management externally communicates the necessary quality information to achieve the entity's objectives. An internal control structure must provide for the identification, capture, and exchange of information within the government and with external parties. Internal communication allows for management or supervisors and staff to communicate responsibilities, requirements, expectations, results, and potential problems. External communication is used to provide information to oversight agencies, legislature, and federal grantors. Information can be communicated in numerous ways, but evidence of the communication and information communicated should be maintained. This could mean saving emails, maintaining logs, retention of public records, retention of memos and reports, or by any other method that would provide sufficient evidence of the communication occurring and the information communicated. Monitoring activities is the last of our 5 internal control components and contains the last 2 of the 17 principles. Number 16, management establishes and operates monitoring activities to monitor the internal control system and evaluate the results. Number 17, management remediates identified internal control deficiencies on a timely basis. Monitoring activities allow management to assess the quality of internal controls over time and make adjustments as necessary. Proper monitoring ensures that controls function properly and continue to be relevant. This can be accomplished in various ways, such as reviewing control activities on a regular basis to ensure they comply with the unit's established policies and procedures, periodic testing of specific controls to determine if they are in place and working effectively, documenting control deficiencies, and developing and implementing a remediation plan. Take it step by step and see where it leads you. Make sure your control system includes activities for each of the 5 internal control components: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, monitoring. Once you have developed your control system, take a step back and review the system as an entire process. Do the procedures and policies that you have implemented in your internal control system work together to help you achieve your objectives? Are there procedures or activities that take up time but don't seem to accomplish any objectives? If so, those procedures should be reevaluated and either be modified to help you meet your objective or eliminate if they are not needed. Also, you would need to determine that there are sufficient controls in place to meet your objectives. Does there appear to be any weaknesses in the system? If so, you will need to design and implement additional controls that would address those weaknesses. So ask yourself a few common sense questions. Are there adequate controls in place over the daily operations, such as processing and recording of receipts and disbursements? Will those controls prevent, detect, or reduce fraud or misstatements in our financial records and reports? Do we have controls in place to ensure that we are complying with our own policies and procedures, state laws and regulations, and federal grant requirements? Once you are satisfied with the internal control system you have created, you'll need to make sure there is documentation for the controls that are supposed to be in place. Start with documenting the 5 components and significant areas first. For regulatory reporting, which is basically cash basis reporting, the significant areas are somewhat basic and include cash handling and management goals. Cash handling includes receiving, dispersing, and reconciling of cash balances, making sure to consider all 5 internal control component areas for each of the significant areas. Management's goals include customer service and compliance with laws and regulations. You want to make sure that you have documentation for the controls that are in place for meeting management's goals. Once you have developed and documented your internal control system, you will need to evaluate the system to make sure that the controls are addressing any identified risks. In evaluating, you will want to identify risk, perform your risk analysis, and respond to those risks by implementing controls, insurance, and acceptance of the risk. This is a continuous process, regularly testing the controls and analyzing them to determine if the control system is still being implemented and still effective. If weaknesses are identified, a response should be developed. The controls will change as the unit's environment changes. Unfortunately, this is not something that you do just one time and then you are done. So now that you have a better understanding about internal controls and their importance, are you going to trust or make sure things are done right in your office? Hopefully, make sure.